The mission of the Kirby Center is to extend the college's teaching mission here to the nation's capital, a place where a proper understanding of the American founders' principles of constitutional government is much needed, to say the least. What American liberals most need is liberal education, deep reading in the classic works of Western literature. In a speech for the sesquicentennial anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, President Calvin Coolidge, himself the beneficiary of a liberal education at Amherst College, said, "We need a better understanding and comprehension of our institutions and a better knowledge of the foundations of government in general. Our forefathers came to certain conclusions and decided upon certain courses of action which have been a great blessing to the world. But before we can understand their conclusions, we must go back and review the courses which they followed. We must think the thoughts they thought." For the American founders were also the beneficiaries of liberal education of a kind that was standard in America in the 19th century, but which nearly disappeared in the 20th century. I can think of no better person to speak on this subject than our guest tonight, Mr. Tracy Lee Simmons, who's been a prominent writer and journalist for over 20 years and teaches humanities in the Westover Honors Program at Lynchburg College. He holds a master's degree in classics from Oxford. He has written for newspapers, magazines, and journals, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Weekly Standard, the New Criterion, and others. He served as an associate editor for National Review under William F. Buckley, Jr. He published Climbing Parnassus, a new apologia for Greek and Latin in 2002, which won a Choice Award for Outstanding Academic Title for that year. He was for many years the director of the Dow Journalism Program at Hillsdale College. His topic tonight is Great Books for Busy People, What the Best Books Teach Us Every Day. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Simmons.
Well, thank you. It's very nice to be back at Hillsdale, and we are at Hillsdale, right? I like to think of the Kirby Center as a kind of embassy. And so this is Hillsdale soil, and they can't get us here. So it's been a long time since I've had anything to do with a Hillsdale event. And as I contemplated this talk this evening, I thought, well, what makes a Hillsdale event a Hillsdale event? And I thought back to my years there, and I realized somewhere, somehow, I have to quote Tocqueville. And I've never really looked for quotations in this way before, but I took down some Tocqueville and I started paging through. This is a dangerous method. And I came across this sentence, and I kid you not. "To remain silent is the most useful service that a mediocre speaker can render for the public good." So I come to you with more than a little humility this evening. Do you remember when, I guess some of you can't, but it was over 30 years ago, when we all in this country found ourselves scared to death over the nightmare of nuclear annihilation, either accidental or deliberate. First, there was 3 Mile Island, which was a real mishap at a nuclear power plant. And then the China Syndrome, which was a film about a near-fictional massive meltdown. And then early in 1983 came The Day After. Remember that? Which was on television, which was a gruesome drama about a nuclear exchange with the Soviet Union and what it might be like for the few unfortunates who would survive more than a few days or weeks. And I remember right after that film aired that many people were talking whimsically about what they would do if they ever heard the siren sound and knew that all that they had known and loved would be obliterated in 30 minutes. Not a bad mental exercise, actually, for concentrating the mind. Well, I cannot remember my own guess as to what I might do, but I do recall one of my friends saying that when the signal came, when those sirens sounded, he would stoically retire to his front porch with a book of some kind, he didn't say which kind, and read quietly while waiting for the final flash. Well, none of us can know perhaps what he or she would do, and I rather suspect that my own response would be more prayerfully feverish than that. But my friend's resolve to remain a civilized man till the end still sticks in my mind. Well, I've been set a theme this evening on great books for busy people, which I hope will not be great last books for busy people in this sense. And it's a pretty jolly sort of topic, probably tailor designed for the very kinds of people likely to work within 20 square miles of this building. So I'd like to talk about these so-called great books and what they can bring to our lives as constant and reliable nourishment. But before I do that, I'd like to talk about why we read, or ought to read at all, apart from the necessities of work and school, and perhaps why I used to see so many people beyond their youth on the DC Metro, and I lived here for 10 years during the 1990s, reading books of a demanding kind that they would probably balked at reading when they were in college. One was War and Peace, which I thought an ambitious choice for the noisy Metro. Another book, significantly during Desert Storm, was the Iliad. Now, these people were no doubt awfully busy, DC people are, though they seemed to find time for reading. What exactly were they doing as they made their way by fits and starts through those long and challenging books? What was motivating those who might not get home till 9 o'clock in the evening or later to take on yet another task like this? Well, my guess is that many of them were trying in piecemeal fashion to get the education they never got at their expensive schools and colleges and universities, which is an admirable way to spend one's otherwise dead time on a subway. Perhaps they shared the pangs of Revolutionary War General Nathaniel Greene when he said, and I quote, "I lament the lack of a liberal education and feel the mist of ignorance to surround me." Now, here is one reason to read great books, which is to make our minds somewhat worthy of the diplomas and degrees hanging on our walls. Venerable documents, if you think about it, made to look far older than they are, and that seem in no way, nonetheless, to reflect the manifest disorder and triviality of our minds so much of the time, no matter how high our IQ. They don't seem to show that. One sensed, as I looked at these people on the Metro, that their reading was not mere time-killing. That's what the Washington Post is for. I always smiled when I saw them and honored their choices. Well, to me, the question, why read great books, is closely akin to why read at all. Because if you think about it, reading really is an extravagant use of precious time. After all, it does require real sacrifices. And so those who read only when they have nothing else to do aren't really reading, perhaps, but filling stray minutes. There are surely worse things to do with one's time, but I wouldn't call such people readers. I'm reminded of Ronald Knox, the English priest and novelist, who said that we are living in a time of loose thinking and unlaborious reading. Well, when I speak of reading here, I'm talking about those who take reading seriously, even when they're reading light, breezy work. They're people for whom books make an essential part of the good and purposeful life, not an ornamental, activity meant merely to perhaps impress other people. That benchmark ups the game considerably for the spare time browser. The people I'm talking about may not be bookworms, but they almost always have a book simmering at low heat somewhere, on a desk, beside a favorite chair, on a bedstand, or in a bag or briefcase for bus or train commutes. And of course, then there are always those good and curious people who read and read rapidly because, as they often say, there's just always more to know. But sometimes what they want to know may be a little more than a new series of facts that they can briskly place into a mental file. They want to cut to their own chase. And this is what reading means for many people. And for those people, speed is likely desirable. Why waste time, after all? Few of us drive to the grocery in order to enjoy the view along the way. We have a mission and we want to get there and get out. Yet, almost all of us are confronted with the need to bring this merely acquisitive attitude to some of our reading occasionally. And let's face it, certain things like 2,000-page laws passed by Congress, locked in ice flows of turgid prose, aren't really meant to be read by human beings at all anyway, at least not by most of us. They seem to exist more for the sheer bulk of and for intimidation, perhaps. And we can be honest, such people, such readers, probably make up the lion's share of readers in most big cities. But no matter how brilliant such people may be, certain kinds of experience in reading will be forever closed to them. Poetry, for example. A poem will not yield up its secrets on command to the spirit that can't wait upon them. A poem isn't so much wooed as read as wooed, I like to say. One may not care for that encounter, of course, but the not caring, if the non-caring person is a man or woman of intelligence, is something mildly to regret, I think. And this brings us back to the question of why we read again. One reads, first of all, and I never tire of saying this, for pleasure. And as we all know, there are different kinds of pleasure. Reading The Great Gatsby gives us one kind of pleasure, Shakespeare another, a well-researched online article another, a penetrating political commentary another, Robert Frost another, and a spy thriller another still. I don't place all these works on the same plane, obviously. I only say that they all provide pleasure and legitimate diversion from the pounding necessities of life. And they might even help to redeem life. Now notice that the possibilities I just cited don't all make for light reading, though most of it can be approached, if you will, lightly. That is, for the purpose of relaxing or reflecting or simply informing oneself, not merely to pass an exam or to gather support for an academic essay. The spirit we adopt in reading really does count. For example, there's pleasure in reading, say, the Federalist Papers. Not the easiest sort of reading, to be sure, and I went over them again this winter. And those pieces by Hamilton, Madison, and Jay do require, for most people, some explanation or elucidation from outside in order to read them aright. But the point is that that book is certainly satisfying for one who reads it slowly and patiently and deliberately, not only with a mind for ideas, but with an eye for images and an ear for rhythms. The founding writers really were that good when they put quill to paper. One walks away, in other words, with something ample and nutritious, a pretty good meal there. It's nearly impossible to put down a better, more abundant book and feel as though you've wasted your time. And in case you've not noticed, that's simply not how most valuable time gets wasted these days. But there's a larger, higher, more bracing reason to read, if you'll allow me to move into a brighter key. We read because we come from peoples of the book, because that's how we pass on the tablets of experience, because it isn't enough to know in some disembodied sense. We must be articulate about what we know. And it is the ability to articulate experience, to enshrine that experience in words and images that allows us to converse and to pass on that which we know and feel to others who come after. We also read because none of us is self-sufficient. We all come into this world impoverished and selfish and shallow. And that's pretty much the way we stay, unless, by regular acts of the will, we maintain intellectual and spiritual health, which may be much harder to maintain than physical health. It takes a lot of effort. When we read the better books, whether of history, literature, letters, philosophy, or what have you, we're reminded that we're not alone, and that others who have traveled this road before us, and that a few of them have found a few answers to the perennial questions, whether of public or personal life, and that they are answers at least as plausible as those that people of our singularly confused time have served up. We also come into this world wired to the world's frenzy and nonsense. Reading work that's pitched well above us, I still think of as an antidote, and a fine one, to both our pride and our anxiety. We're reminded that the obsessions and fears of the day really are transient. Or, depending on their nature, we learn that they're permanent, in which case, trying to solve them as problems is like swatting fleas. Some problems never do get solved, only ameliorated. Notice that some can learn that lesson by attentive reading, others only by experience, and perhaps the rest run for political office. And please allow me a digression on words, because words are the medium here. I've been teaching college students off and on for well over 20 years now. And in that time, I've been led to conclude at least two things. First, that students are every bit as intelligent today as they ever have been, at least in my limited exposure. And in some ways, I'm happy to report, better mannered than my peers were. And I've noticed, second, that their vocabularies have been contracting steadily. That is, the number of words, let alone cultural references from the past, that they're likely to know upon entering college has been decreasing almost measurably. In fact, some analysts believe they have measured the shift over the decades. By one reckoning, the average vocabulary American adults arm themselves with ranges between 10,000 and 20,000 words. Though whether those figures reflect real word use or real understanding, I don't know. The two are certainly not the same. A glance at a newspaper, online blog, or C-SPAN will tell you that. I'm reminded of John Henry Newman, who once said that nothing is more common for people to think that because they know what the words are, that they understand the ideas they stand for. One study in 1984 places the figure of average vocabulary as high as 45,000 words, though one by 1992 suggested the number to be far lower and closer to 5,000 words. Now, I cannot know the methods used in these studies, and I customarily cast a gimlet eye on such things, but I suspect the lower figures to be closer to the truth. And they're getting lower. Now, this condition of contraction, if, as I say, it exists, as I believe it does, should raise alarms for us. And why? Because words are the currency of exchange, really, for thinking people. The fewer words we know, the fewer thoughts we can think, and the fewer subtleties we can express. In a phrase, the less intellectually adult we are. Our maturity is stunted. It's as though one were to reduce one's sense of sight to primary colors only. All other colors and shades and nuances would be invisible. Now, one may be able to function in such a world, true, but how much less rich and how much poorer that world would be. But the stakes may be even higher. Time passing and the trend continuing, communicating with others would become in the future more and more labored. Finer shades of meaning in sophisticated debate, and note the metaphor of the very word shades there, would be strained to the breaking point, and wit would be impossible. As a culture, we could all end up back in the second grade. And I ask you, what if there should come a day when, for example, the word unalienable were to lapse out of our working vocabularies completely? Which is to say, we might recognize the sound of it, perhaps even be able to take a jab at what it means, but we couldn't quite define it to a sixth grade teacher's satisfaction. How then would we read the Declaration of Independence? Just what does that peculiar word modifying those rights in unalienable rights mean? The answer is that we would likely settle back comfortably into an easy chair of soft ignorance and consent to let the experts deal with all that. But then some people think that that time has already arrived. And if that should be true, even somewhat true, incipiently true, the Republic may be in more than a little danger if we are to take seriously Mr. Jefferson's warning that those who expect to remain both ignorant and free expect what never was and never will be. Putting a sharper point on this same thought, Jefferson also told us that no nation is permitted to live in ignorance with impunity. We pay the penalty eventually. In other words, a tiny, innocent, and seemingly insignificant slide away from literacy like this, a forgotten word here, a word's meaning stretched to the snapping point there, a word indifferently grasped, could, not too far down the road, compromise our very citizenship. Because if we lose the meaning of the word unalienable, we could also lose the meaning of this grand experiment in government, one that's been sustained for almost 2.5 centuries now. Pretty high stakes indeed. Education really is that vital to the life of this country. So here's to the good and valiant teachers among us. And again, if people's vocabularies are really contracting nowadays, is not that an odd thing to be happening in an assimilative time when technology is busy about augmenting the language with so many new terms? How could this possibly be? The one guess I'll make before going on is the surmise that we're giving less attention to words, to their meanings, to their histories, to their sounds, to their rhythms, to their textures in our homes, in our schools, and in our lives. It's not enough to know what words mean, but what they can mean, and to see them not on dry, antiseptic word lists, but in action, scampering about in their native habitats. This is what it really means to read seriously. Here certainly is not an easily soluble problem. How exactly do we restore that ethos to our society and to our culture? The answer to that is we cannot. But we can do so individually. And who can know where that solitary effort might lead? Certainly, if people read more, that is, if they invited more quiet and reflection into their loud, cluttered worlds besieged with misused words, then the power of words properly and artfully employed could reassert itself. And behind every new word learned, a new thought, a new expression, a new idea might be waiting, and one that we could have owned long before had we discovered it earlier. This is the treasure that so many of us let sit outside our doors in the cold. and it needn't be that way. But enough of that. I was talking just now about a few of the advantages of reading great books. Well, here is another. Independence. Not only do we achieve an independence of mind, but in some real sense, an independence from our own time, or at least the means of a respite from it. If we think about it, we recognize that so many great people of the past were great precisely because there was something about them that was timeless, something about them that was untethered. They were not always locked into the mores and expectations and assumption of their era as lesser people around them were. They could think dispassionately, detachedly. They could see possibilities, not to mention absurdities, more clearly. Reading can do this for us too. For instance, a couple hours spent with Dickens' Hard Times can free us from a few of the reigning assumptions of our own time and help us to see our own world in a new revelatory light. We become less chained to our own day and can find sympathies and insights within ourselves of which we might not have expected ourselves capable. This is more than an intellectual edge. It's an enhancement of life. And yes, we learn more, many more words. We begin to see the world both as we wish it to be, but also as it is. I'm reminded of these words of Henry James. Every talk on great books should include at least one quotation from Henry James, who wrote, not in one of his novels, but in one of his reviews, this passage I find still haunting. This is what his reading, his study of history has taught him, that evil is insolent and strong, beauty enchanting but rare, goodness very apt to be weak, folly very apt to be defiant, wickedness to carry the day, imbeciles to be in very great places, people of sense in small, and mankind generally unhappy. That's one sentence. As we like to say sometimes, hard liquor on that one. So I wanted to get a little light and talk about what busy people should do with their reading lives. So I brought Tracy's 10 points. Everyone, and this is the city for points and bullet points of other kinds. So we finally get to the bone of this talk. How do we find time to devote to books, however good or great, when we're still finding time to stop by the dry cleaners after work? Well, there's no easy or one way to answer this, but I'll begin with a reminder from the poet William Blake. We become what we behold. We become what we behold. Another way of saying that for our purposes may be we are what we read. So, point one, choose wisely. Stand back and think about how little of your time you have to lend to serious reading. And don't just consider this generally. Count up the hours, monthly, weekly, daily. Estimate that number of hours that you have for reading per week, and you'll see that even if you're an industrious reader, able to snatch odd moments with a book while standing in line at the post office, something I cannot do, still those hours are limited. Do your best, always recalling Mark Twain's declaration that the man who does not read good books has no advantage over the man who cannot read them. Or, to vary the thought, I think it was Harry Truman who once said that every book is a new book to someone who hasn't read it. So, how many hours do you have for reading per week? 20? 10? 6? 2? That puts the matter in a truer light I think, for each of us. And that's why we must choose judiciously. I rarely advise anybody to adopt someone else's list of must-read books, but depending on the advisor, there are worse ways. Go for interest first. Don't pick up, as I saw a friend of mine do a few years ago, The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith, just because many imposing people are doing so. Pick it up only if you feel some real impulsion to read it. And a fascination with economic theory wouldn't hurt. When we pick up books too far outside our ken, we run the risk of frustration and burnout. So pick and stay with whatever you imagine you'll be itching to get back to in spare moments. And finish it in the interests of self-respect. Above all, don't make time for reading. I hear people say that all the time. I'm going to make time for reading. Don't make time. Take it. Take it. Budget your days and weeks in such ways as to make reading at least as important as going to the gym. Remember that whatever we're not sacrificing for really isn't all that important to us. Second point. If you've been out of regular, serious reading for a while, get back in the swim with books written in periods that fascinate you, like 16th century England or 19th century Russia. Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, and Chekhov would keep you busy for quite a few fiscal years if you end up catching their bug. And categories count too. Why should we exclusively read one work of, say, history after another? There's nothing wrong with that, of course. But I would only say that if history is your forte, try also to read historical accounts written during or close to the period being examined. Reading too much contemporarily written history runs the risk of seeing that time exclusively through the lenses of our time, which isn't the idea, or not quite the idea, of gaining intellectual independence. Third point. If you're especially ambitious, depart from your field of familiarity. If you're most uncomfortable with history, for example, if you're most comfortable, I should say, with history, make a point of reading a novel and reading it well. Willa Cather's My Antonia will tell you just as much about the prairies during the second half of the 19th century in the United States as will any study of the place and period, and perhaps more, as Cather distills essences. This is the power of art. It's also one of those books you'll look forward to rereading. Footnote, that's another significant understanding we need to bear in mind about serious readers. They reread things. Once someone was interviewing C.S. Lewis about some book or other and said, Professor Lewis, have you read that certain book by so-and-so? And Lewis's answer was, oh, I've read it, yes, so no. I think it was Nabokov later who said that in a strange way, books cannot be read. They can only be reread. Paradoxically true, I think. Well, this is also, My Antonia, one of those books you'll want to reread time and time again. And again, I use these examples of books that I've been looking at within the last 12 months myself. Or read the Adams-Jefferson correspondence. You'll get lots of history there, and much else besides. But if you're more at home with novels, if you're one of those people, maybe a shot at political theory may be just the thing. Rousseau's long treatise called Discourse on the Origins and Basis of Inequality Among Men might put you in thicker weeds. But reading that work alongside his Emile will give you an understanding of the political left-right divide that you could gain really in no other way. And if you're a policy wonk, read poetry, which will give you one of the very few inducements in your life to humility, as a reminder that no matter how much the machinery of state and society be tinkered with, mystery remains. Indeed, mystery will out. As Keats once said, poetry emboldens the soul to accept mystery. You'll also enjoy a relief from the inflated formulations of policy prose and be reminded of how real people sound, good and bad, sophisticated and unsophisticated. Fourth point, I will get to the end. Some wish to keep their private reading private, a refuge from the opinionated, talkative atmosphere we breathe every day. Others, though, wish to impart what they're reading to others in rich discussion. And if you are so inclined, find intelligent, receptive ears. They, too, may latch on to your secret and start reading again. And this is how many people pick up what they missed while sleeping in class. Fifth point. I talked before of bedstand reading, but beware of leaving your most serious reading to that time of day when wine has already bestowed its blessings upon mind and spirit. Moby Dick requires more than a modicum of alertness. So does Dante. Sixth point. Don't forget that we go to great books not only to find parallels between our lives and the times of those of others, but also simply to stew ourselves in the very otherness of other worlds, a place where the current effluvia of pop culture cannot intrude. Soak yourself in that otherness and return with a freshened view of your own time. And then, a formidable task, see how much you can integrate some of that otherness, some of that strangeness into your own life. It was Thomas Jefferson again who once said that it's the object of deep study and thought to integrate knowledge into the personality. At that, not just integrate knowledge into the mind, integrate it into the personality. Try that. And seventh point, read deliberately. Take a year on one book, if that's what it takes, to receive it with something like completeness. Glory in it. Reread vast sections before going forward. Only a perverse age could put such a premium on speed. Recall the words of Aldous Huxley. To be well informed, one must read merely informative books. To be cultivated, one must read slowly and with a lingering appreciation. Eighth point. Despite what I just suggested about the comparative equality of all genres, keep in mind a study once cited by The Economist magazine concluding that those people possessing the largest vocabularies are those who read fiction, mainly because fiction tends to use a larger range of words. This may explain, of course, why some people prefer nonfiction. But that's a bad bargain. The payoff and the pleasure with imaginative literature is far greater, a fact once confirmed by the Civil War historian Shelby Foote, who once told me that his training as a novelist served him far better in writing his massive 3-volume narrative of that war than any secondary works of scholarship he consulted. So, if you're not a reader of fiction, read one novel per year anyway, but make it a good one. Fear not the big book. C.S. Lewis said in one of his letters, "The great beauty of long books is that however often you have read them, there are still large tracts you have forgotten." You ever heard someone say of a particular book, "Oh yes, I've read that," as though it's been drained of all of its juice. It's no longer real for them. Did you read Hamlet? Oh, yes, 11th grade. As though they're saying, never touch that again. Whereas, in fact, it might take a lifetime to appreciate a play like that with anything like fullness. So as I say, make the novel you choose a good one, a very good one, and a long one. 9th point. Remember that the main idea is to find yourself doing commerce not only with the ideas as you read, an understandable fixation for the politically engaged, but with words. Words in all their power and variety and color. So, keep a notebook to remind yourself of salient bits, sentences, phrases, words from each book so that you won't lose all its substance with time. After a few years, you may find that this notebook will amount to an intellectual memoir of yours. A reminder that your life way back when was not merely a formless mess of one meeting after another, but that it had ballast, it had weight. Oh yes, I remember the summer of 2015, you may say. That was the summer of Henry Adams and Faulkner. There really are worse ways to earmark our days. And 10th and final point, reading the great books is simply another way of extending experience. Remember that it's been said that, and I think it was Ortega y Gasset who said this, that culture is what's left over after everything we've read has been forgotten. It's the residue, the unarticulated survival. A Frenchman once called memory the nerve of understanding. I've never forgotten that, the nerve of understanding. We read in that little book some of us read in school called 1066 and all that. I don't know if you ever read that. There's a marvelous sentence there to the effect that history is not what happened, it's what you can remember. History is not what happened, it's what you can remember. By this standard, history does not even exist for many people. And that is a frightening thought. If this be true, the very act of reading a good or great book can be an exercise in reclaiming memory, and in the end, to reclaiming a culture worth preserving. And it also ennobles us. Thank you.
Current tsunami of technology has on reading. It seems to me now with texting and YouTube and all this that young people, I have a daughter, they're absorbed in this, and the hours they spend watching silly videos and things is just mind-blowing. And do you see that as a problem, and what should we do about it?
Well, my moderate response to that is to say that the road to hell is paved with good inventions. I think it's terrible. I do hesitate to say it because I'm of an age now where I don't want to seem older than I am. But I do, when I'm walking across a college campus and I see everybody on a phone, everybody's on a phone, everyone's texting or looking for something or other on Google or shopping for something, they're not really alone. A lot of people don't take long walks anymore. We have a marvelous trail down where I live, and people will be texting along this nature trail, or they'll be listening to something, their ears, and of course it's a spring day. There are certain birds out you haven't heard for many months, but they'll never hear them. So the problem of technology is pervasive. I like to be a good Aristotelian and believe that nothing of itself is bad just in itself. That there are good uses to be put to all these things. I don't think anything's evil. But the gadgets do make it easier for good people to waste their time. In the generation before, it was television that could waste the time. In the generation before that, it was radio that could waste the time, or movies that could waste the time, or comic books that could waste time. But you don't want to assume any equality there because it's you use the word tsunami. I think that's accurate. I tease them really. I don't. Anything I say, I want to make more like something a big brother would say. But I do challenge them sometimes to turn off their phones for an entire day. And some tried it. More than half enjoyed it. All said it was difficult. Because it's an addiction. It might be a benign one, but it is an addiction. But that comes to the point of time. If you have, and some of us, at any time of our lives, we may have only a 2-hour window. A lot of people say they don't have time to read, and then you'll hear about the things they do. Clearly disposable things. They say, "Oh, I wish I had more time to read. I love to read." No, they don't. I tell them, "No, you don't. What are you?" It's the first thing I ask. What are you giving up in order to read? And they'll often be unable to say anything. So they really don't want to read. I always like to have something brewing all the time. I travel with books. When I'm traveling, I don't get to read them very much, but I like to have them there. And I wish more young people would take that attitude. Some are returning to that, though. I read something a few months ago to the effect that college students or college-age people today are reading more actual books and eschewing some of the electronic devices for reading them. So I do know, I can name probably 5 people around 20 years old who have gotten rid of Kindles and Nooks and so forth, and because they prefer the heft of a real book. So I don't think we're without hope, but if you are 20 years old and you've grown up in a world with that has always had the internet and has always had these little toys about, I imagine it's pretty hard to get rid of them.
Hi, Tracy. I'm just curious.
Hello, Betsy.
It's so nice to see you. I'm just curious if there's a book from the last 5 years, like 1 or 2 books that's been recently published that you like the most or that you think is maybe a good example of contemporary book writing.
I was a book reviewer for so many years. And for a period of that time, in the early 90s, I reviewed nothing but new novels. And so when I didn't have to do that anymore, I stopped reading a lot of contemporary books. So I suppose the answer to that would be some of the books I've had to review for the Post or somebody. There's a nice book by about Prince Philip. I thought that was revealing about a lot of 20th century global politics even, and something I didn't particularly expect. But I haven't really read too many contemporary books. I'll think of something as soon as I go on to another question. But since I'm teaching history and literature and philosophy, believe it or not now, my mind is in amber. It's in another time, in a sense.
If a newspaper is the first draft of history, as it's been said. And our younger generations no longer read newspapers. They won't even have the memory that you called history, especially if they're getting their news from the comedy shows. But another question that I've heard, and maybe you can answer this, we may be raising a generation of people who only go to the internet for source material, leaving many, many answers tucked away on the shelves of a college library that no longer has visitors.
I sense that all the time. My students, when they have to write a paper, will go immediately to Google. And they'll tell me, well, I had a hard time finding this or that. And I said, well, what did you find in the library? They didn't even go. They didn't even darken the door of the library. I said, you're missing so much by simply being able to browse through the stacks. You'll find something that you weren't looking for, and it's just the thing you actually want. It's the thing you actually need, and you wouldn't have known it was there. So that would, I suppose, that would be another way of answering this gentleman's question. That technology really is doing a number on our deliberativeness. The idea being that a lot of people, if they're 19 or 20, they think that everything really is at their fingertips. It's all there. They don't realize that certain things need to be edited, that not all knowledge is equal. That's something I'm finding with students, that if it's all on the internet, it's all equal. It doesn't matter it doesn't matter where it comes from. The provenance doesn't matter at all. If it's on the internet, everything is of a kind of equal quality, and I find that disturbing, and I do try to rub up against it, but it's hard to do because not all of their instructors may be doing the same thing.
This is a question from our Twitter audience. What is your list of 10 books to be reread more than once for every man of letters?
Say it again.
What is your 10 books to be reread more than once for every man of letters?
Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France. I read that about 25 years ago in a very summary fashion, and I didn't quite understand it, and I've read it again within the last year or two, and it's been a marvelous experience. That's something I want to keep reading. I don't have a list of 10 books. I have read Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. That's several volumes. I don't intend to do it again unless I'm in prison. Oh, well, of course. But I teach Plato. And Aristotle's Ethics, I'm with Dr. Arnn on that one. That's something that I teach every year, the whole book, not that's a marvelous one. I was reading the Age of Revolution volume last week. I wanted to see what he thought of the French Revolution. So that's a marvelous one. But he had some sympathy for them, though. It was a marvelously nuanced view of it. Yeah. I'm not off the hook there. I would welcome anyone's suggestion of other books, because every reader is going to have an eclectic list. So I'm a classicist by training, so I'm going to say Plato and Virgil and Aristotle and Aeschylus and Aristophanes. I'm going to say Seneca's letters. Aquinas, absolutely. The Latin is beautiful, by the way. You need you need a particular Latin dictionary to read Aquinas well, and I have not read him entire, but maybe 100 pages in the Latin, and many more in translation. So anything by Aquinas, the Summa. You have to be in a certain mood, I suppose, to read Aquinas. A philosophical mood, Dante, absolutely. Now, there's an example of someone I've not read in 6 or 7 years, 8 years. That's getting to be too long. So I would add Dante to that. It's sort of like the desert island books where they simply say, okay, we give you the Bible and we give you Shakespeare. Now, get to it. What would you read? Boswell's Life of Johnson, I would add to it. I went on a trip to Italy and Greece about 3 months ago, and I was there for 3 weeks, 4 weeks or so, and I took that with me. And that's very good company. Practically anything by Dickens. Proust. I'm a very strange reader in that way. I love Proust. I've gone through all of that twice, but that's a good many volumes, and I do want to go through that again. I could stand not to read Gibbon again, but I would hate to think I would be on my way to death without reading Proust one more time. And I think I would leave the list there. I'm an early riser. I usually wake up between 4:30 and 5. And I like to read in bed a little bit. And then late afternoon, and then evening. But if I'm going to have a nice long evening of reading, I don't give myself wine for dinner because I need to elongate the evening as much as I can. So early morning, late afternoon, early evening would be my optimal time. But people's metabolisms are different, so I don't know what that would be for anyone else.
We have time for one.
It struck me, you didn't touch on this, but I wonder if you'd agree with me on this, that one of the things that I think is really missing in getting information on a computer is there's no tangential learning. It's what you talked about or alluded to in going into the stacks. And you find all sorts of things that you didn't know you needed to know. And it was wonderful that way. And I have such a hard time getting my daughter to use a dictionary or encyclopedia. She goes to the computer. But, I can't, every time I open encyclopedia dictionary, I always learn something more than what I thought I was just looking for. And I think that's a tremendous dimension of learning that is being lost on just using the computer. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, although I would be happy if some of my students would look up things on the computer. Sometimes I have, for readings, for instance, on a particular day, we're going to read so many chapters of this or that, and I'll say to them, we're going to have a quiz, and it's going to be on nothing but vocabulary. Nothing. I'm not asking you any profound questions about meaning. I just want to know that you know every word in those 2 chapters. That is, if you weren't familiar with a particular word, I want you to look it up and I want you to write it down. And some of them will say, well, do you do that? I said, I do it all the time. I still keep notebooks. I write down new words all the time, and usually words that amuse me, like hypergamy. It's a marvelous word for marrying above yourself. Isn't that marvelous? The idea is good enough, but we've got a word for it. So, thank you.